Hello, everyone. It's Joe Gemelli. I wanted to do a book reading for you. I just wrote this book, and I might catch some shit for this book, but it's a story that needed to be told, and I'm the only one who's going to tell it. So, with that being said, this is my book. It was just finished tonight. It's called Dan and the Strawberry Heathen. To my Brittany, no matter the means, no matter the ends, no matter the consequences. Should I fall asleep knowing that I loved you to my fullest potential, rest assured that it would be while wearing a smile. Chapter 1. Put another X on the calendar. Around about the turn of the season, as the leaves began to change, there lived a worthless, nameless man on the edge of suburbia and metropolis. Recently acquitted of a love much too false to maintain any longer, he fought with his demons day in and day out. This wicked woman who had grown obsessed with him, Violet, she couldn't understand that she was not the reason he felt the way he did. Stricken with guilt from a life he'd left before and deepening lower into madness with each passing day. It was almost as if time itself had forgotten him in those moments, and his nails grew thin from trying to claw himself out of desperation into a normal subsistence. His eyes had fallen cold to anything and everything sometimes, staring right through and seeing only his own broken reflection. This nameless man, he felt faceless at times too. Those around him passing by without a glance, not stopping even in vain to see what was wrong. He wore the expression of a desolate being on his shell of a face, but it seemed no one paid notice. He would wake, he would work, and he would sleep. For months the man kept at his cycle, and the pain only consumed him more. He eventually found it harder to wake, harder to motivate himself to work, harder to sleep soundly. There was a pub along the road on which he used to live prior to the fallout, just west of the line between his hometown of Springvale and Mogadale, the even smaller, even quainter suburb of his suburb. This pub had been his place of haven for years now, and he began to rely on the familiar faces there for relief from his condition. Friends with the owners and workers, whether the bar was packed or he was the only patron on any given night, he'd always have someone to talk to. At times, that bar would feel more like home to him than his own house, which lay completely dormant save for the sleeping cat while he was away. It had been a year of change for him, the wind picking up the pieces of his shattered past and whispering them away to the west as he sat eagerly awaiting what was to blow in from the east. When nothing came, though, disheartened, he'd find himself at the bar more and more often. From one night a week to two, and eventually 3 and 4, he was going for the karaoke, he'd tell himself. He was going for the social atmosphere. But inside he knew what he was really after was enough drink to numb what he had brewing inside. Those around him at the bar knew of him, but not of what he had done. Not of his personal life or lack thereof. Not of the trials and tribulations he'd unintentionally put all of his interpersonal relationships through for Violet. Not of his disdain for ever being with her, and not of his longing for a normal life. All they saw was a man who could sing, be him broken or whole, and that was all that mattered. Heartbroken of his own doing and longing for the hands of his past lover before Violet, the man began to make some rather questionable decisions. He'd lost control of himself in this regard, taking no care in what he'd eat or drink, wary not of those who sat around him, nor their intentions. He'd land himself in bed with a prostitute eventually, and as he lay there, he'd think, I deserve to pay for love. What he did not know was that it was all about to change, forever. Chapter 2. We Own the Night. Now, October had always been a month of celebration for the man. Every year on the 6th of October would he and his love get together to celebrate another year of their union, and every 31st day would grow to become his favorite holiday out of all of them, because it was one last party with life before crawling into the dark, cold winter months. This year, however, overcome with guilt, he decided that enough was enough, and on the first night of October, he laid in bed with his hand wrapped around his pistol. Now and again he'd raise it to his head, imagining the world around him would light up with relief if he were to go. It seemed a comforting thought that his existence would no longer be a burden to bear for all those whom he had wronged thus far, and it was in that moment and no sooner that he had begun to squeeze the trigger than a knock came from the door. Shaken from his haze, the man put the gun down and opened the door to find an old school friend standing there, his hands behind his back. Damien had known the man for several years, and he knew of the struggles his life had raised for him in recent months. He entered the house, now feeling more of a home than ever before with the presence of someone else for the first time in a long while, and he extended his arms out in front of him. His hands holding an acoustic guitar, he said, "I know what you've been going through lately, and I wanted to help you out. You can use this to put your feelings into something productive." And with that, Damien left. And for the rest of the night, the man played the guitar, his pistol sighing for having been relieved of the duty of taking his life that night. By no means did the coping get easier until the night of the 11th. After a school football game for which the man had volunteered his time to the marching band, he had decided it was as good a night as ever to inebriate himself at the bar he called home. He walked in the door to find a crowd of semi-familiar faces, but paid no mind to who he would encounter that. He had pictured this as a quiet, introspective evening with the occasional song on the karaoke set and nothing more. But after having ordered his drink, a voice entirely too familiar filled his ears with an "Oh my God!" at the sight of him, and he turned to look at its source. There, with a smile on her face, she stood, arms outstretched at an angle from her sides. He at first could not remember her name, as they had met 2 years prior, and only for one night. But the girl had never left his subconscious from that past occasion. Something had always seemed so very, very familiar about her, and yet he couldn't quite put his finger on it. His soul lit up in a burst of joyous flames as she hugged him, and he knew that there was history here in a former life and to be made in this one. "Do you remember me?" the girl asked him, still showing a smile that lit up his heart like a firework on the 4th of July as she pulled away from his embrace. His expression from before the encounter must have decided to hang around, and once he realized, he made sure to fix it, taking care not to make it too obvious that he was simultaneously figuring out how to show warmth and friendliness while also admiring her beauty for the second time in his life. Yeah, you had me sing the middle for you last time I saw you here," he said, now genuinely smiling after remembering how to do such a silly thing. "You do remember," she smiled. "That's legit my favorite song. How have you been?" Things have been kind of rough lately. How about you?" And thus began a conversation between the two that lasted from table to table, outside to inside and back again for the remainder of the night. They spoke of each other's passions, favorite bands, and those other relative things that made them happy, taking note of the several coincidences between their list. She had asked him at one point, "Why are we not best friends?" And the truth was, he had wondered why they weren't already much more than that, and where she'd been all of his life. Because in those hours that he was in her presence, it's as if time had remembered him. It's as if life seemed hopeful for him once more, and all at once he had forgotten the very pain in his heart that led him to the bar that night to begin with. They spoke for so long that the two hardly noticed the time passing by, and the bar was slated to close soon for the night. They took turns leaving the conversation to sing and then coming right back to pick up where they left off. And every time he heard her sing, it felt like it was the only sound in the world that his ears wanted to hear. Out front, the two shared a cigarette. And he had made mention that when the bar closed, he was always given the privilege of singing the last song. "Not this time, dude," she said with a smirk on her face. He checked the time and realized that the bar was closing in less than 5 minutes, and stealthily, or so he thought, he snuck back into the bar and queued up his last song for the night, Closing Time by Semisonic. It had become his karaoke ritual, singing that song right at 2 o'clock in the morning, after all. The girl threw a fit, but the man handed her a microphone and they sang the song together. It was actually the second duet that they had done that night, but this one was different. This one was special. After his song, he asked her what she would like to sing. Now, being well after the time that the karaoke machine was supposed to be turned off, the crowd began to leave after cashing out and tipping the bartender for the night, but he didn't care. He wanted to make sure that she got what she needed to go home happy. An Alanis Morissette song was her choice, and it was beautiful. He gave her a standing ovation at its conclusion. The two then sat at the bar and talked, ignoring the dismay of the bartender, increasingly growing to the point of them getting kicked out of the bar, and then continued that conversation in the frigid autumn air on the hood of his car. That's when she called him by a name that he had long since forgotten, a name that was not his own, but felt as right as rain. She called him Dan, and Dan he became. In that moment, he had been given an identity. He had been given a life, a purpose, and most importantly, a chance at what felt like the most powerful of all friendships in the world. And then he realized he hadn't gotten her name yet. Stephanie, she replied, now smiling at his poor memory, despite his insistence on having a photographic memory earlier in the night. Now she was laughing at him, and he laughed back. It felt odd to him at first, genuine laughter. But when you're so enchanted by someone, it doesn't seem to matter what had you so deeply enveloped in darkness before. Dan invited his Stephanie to his upcoming Halloween party, to which she accepted the invitation but couldn't guarantee an appearance. She did have a daughter, after all. But that didn't matter to Dan. If her daughter be anything like her mother, that's even more reason to keep them around, and missing a party or an event here or there is a small price to pay for such a magnificent human to be in his life once again. The two bid their farewells for the night, locked in an embrace that felt the heat grow between them with each passing second. Dan got in his car to drive home, still beaming with this sudden happiness that had overcome both his mind and spirit. This was the beginning of something so incredible, it had seemed. Chapter 3. We all have teeth that can bite underneath. As the days went by, Dan started to wonder when, or even if, he'd ever hear from that lovely creature again. The weekend passed by seamlessly, his thirst for alcoholic relief finally satiated altogether by something much less harmful to his body. And on the next Monday, there came a message for him. Now, Dan was a bit of a songwriter in light of his recent tragedies, and that seemed to be one of the few ways he could cope with what happened, writing it out for the masses to enjoy. This particular day was a bad one for Dan, though, as he began to question his own sanity. You see, Dan had been involved in what had seemed like a harmless fender bender way back in February. That crash alone is what he had felt inspired him to make all of those sudden, abrupt changes for the worst, those that had led him to his current state of affairs. It was a Friday morning, bleak and cold, but not snowy, at least not as snowy as one would expect a Midwestern winter to be. Dan, running late for work, would forget to defrost his windshield, and the sun pouring over it from the east as it rose to greet the morning would cause a great deal of detriment to his vision while driving through downtown. A poor Kia Rondo with a pediatrician inside would be the victim of his grill, but his vehicle took all of the brunt of the collision, busting the radiator and painting the city streets green for a time. His lover, gone away for a visit to far Tennessee he had originally been invited to undertake as well, would receive none of his texts for help. It was in this moment that Dan began to wonder what the rest of his life held, just as you would after succumbing to a life-threatening event. He walked away without a scratch that day, at least physically anyway. But now thinking back after all those months of uprooting himself and changing his life completely, he began to wonder if maybe he had been injured, and seriously at that. Now looking for an excuse as to why he had left this lover of his, moved across town, and transitioned to malfeasance in the eyes of the universe, he began to toy with the idea that maybe he had been in a coma the whole time. The message that Dan received, it was from Stephanie. Seeing her name scroll across the screen helped to shake him from the turmoil into which these thoughts had forced him. It seemed almost perfect timing, too, as Dan had just finished writing a song about his alleged comatose adventures, and he shared it with her. As it would turn out, Stephanie was a bit of a writer, too. She would write poems, spoken word, rhyming or not, songs incomplete that tell of the troubles her life had held at the time. Stories, it seemed, that spoke to Dan's heart. The two would go on to share their writings on a daily basis until their conversations became wholly and magnificently immersive. They had learned much about each other in just a few short days, and still it felt as if they'd known each other all their lives. It was when she had begun to really share these stories, these plights that up until now only her and her journal knew about, that he realized how deeply he truly loved Stephanie. There was a bit of a problem on the logistical side of this, though. As fate would have it, Stephanie had been married for just over 2 years to her high school sweetheart. The two had been together nearly 15 years, the more recent of which seemed to have wasted her away. She began to speak on her own current situation, saying that her marriage was nothing short of complacent, and that, truth be told, a lot of the more heart-wrenching stories she'd written as of late had been based on wrongdoings and mistreatments from her husband. Dan's heart broke to hear that such a beautiful soul could be so wrongfully paired with such a man who puts her through hell to the day's end. Dan knew that she was meant for him, but he had never fallen into such a trap before. He had never ventured into another man's territory to claim what was so rightfully his. And, he thought, I'm not going to start now. There's an old saying for situations like this in terms of things that need to change, and all it takes is the will of a single man. Dan did not know it just yet, but he was about to embark on a journey of terrifying new highs and threateningly new lows. For now, though, he'd keep her at arm's length. He'd love her silently and be a bastion of support for her when things went awry. Despite his best intentions, the conversations began to lean back and forth on the edge of friendly and more than friendly. And being that it had been some time since he felt genuine attraction from a counterpart, he was not quick to correct this behavior. It was dubbed the witching hour, when around 7:30 p.m. every night, the conversation would turn to fantasies never before spoken aloud, and following weekend would change things for what was sure to be better for the both of them. On the night of October 19th, Dan had finally gained the courage and strength to attend another Halloween party despite the lingering resentments of this time of year still clinging on by the threads of his coat. That same night, Stephanie was attending her sister's birthday party. The two were separately but equally intoxicated, still holding a dirty conversation from earlier when Dan returned back to his home for the night and curled up with his cat in bed. The conversation turned sweeter then when Stephanie made the final slip. There's something I want to say to you, but I don't know how to say it. I'll guess. Let's make a game of it. Okay. This is something that you don't typically say to many people. Yes. It's something that's not easy to say, and you're afraid if you say it, you'll end up ruining what you have or whatever is between us. In that case, I love you too. Fuck. Chapter 4. There's nothing wrong with just a taste of what you paid for. In the coming days, talks would shift dramatically from the eager friendliness they had exhibited prior to the big reveal into plans for a future. Stephanie had realized she was no longer happy within what she had vowed to uphold till death do they part. Dan was caught up in the moment, a fiend for the next time he'd hear her say those words again. They'd talk to each other through Snapchat, all day, every day, already accruing an admirable streak for people who don't talk much with others. I really need to see you now, said Dan, overzealous and excited for what was to come. Do you work Friday? Stephanie asked, and it seemed like she had an idea brewing under her flowing strawberry blonde hair. And so as Friday approached, the two would hash out their plan. Dan would come visit her at work to have lunch, and Stephanie was regularly all alone on Fridays. The possibilities were endless, for lack of a better euphemistic cliche. Friday morning, Dan woke at around the time he usually would to get up for work, and the excitement warmed him to the point of being unable to get back to sleep. He didn't much care to, either. He'd drive all the way up to Houston, nearly a half-hour drive, to meet her for lunch. Just lunch, he thought. After all, dear gods was he nervous about all this. Though the two were idiots, and the universe smiled upon their naivete, they continued. The conversations Dan and Stephanie would have always held an air of flirting, but with much deeper nuances behind them. This morning was no different from those times as the two geared up to meet each other in person for the first time since that night at the bar, though excitement and nervousness permeated their words and imbued the feeling of butterflies rising from Dan's throat. The time came, and Dan found himself in the parking lot of a small financial firm on the outskirts of the prestigious Houston town center. Inside was his ethereal lover, answering phones and eagerly awaiting his arrival. He swallowed hard and killed the batteries in his vaporizer with one last pull, making sure to gain the rush of nicotine he needed to build his confidence back up. This vice was one of many things that the two had shared separately. Dan started in towards the building and paused at Stephanie's car, a maroon-colored Chevy Equinox. He chuckled at how ironic it was that such a beautiful soul would drive something named after the changing of the season. Sometimes it felt like she rode in on the autumn equinox, the leaves carrying her weightlessly to him directly as they zipped through the air. Also ironically, though, Stephanie had always hated the fall. The change of leaves, it reminded her of her own mortality and the deaths of those that had gone before her. He knew, though, that through the rough patches every year he'd stay by her side and hold her a little tighter as the foliage exploded into a sea of reds and yellows once more. As he entered the building and turned the corner to find her in her office, Stephanie had already stood up, beaming from ear to ear with a smile that could bring the most lifeless of plants back to fruition. There truly was a magic about her that Dan just couldn't quite explain yet, but he was determined to get to the bottom of it. He was greeted halfway across the room with a hug, and once again his world was calm. The plaguing thoughts of all that had happened to this point were gone, and all that was left in that moment was the two of them, united once again. Just then, a whirring noise made itself known from behind Dan, and he turned around to find a middle-aged man in a motorized wheelchair slowly approaching him. Stephanie had neglected to tell Dan that one of her bosses would be there this Friday, but that didn't seem to matter. Any time spent with her was worth whatever else may steal the show. "I'm Scott," said the man. He extended one hand to shake Dan's hand, and the two exchanged both pleasantries and lighthearted jokes at Stephanie's expense. Dan had already heard all about Scott at this point, and he didn't much care for the man. Nevertheless, he retired back into his office and left the two lovers alone once more. Dan sat down across the desk from Stephanie and said, "So, ma'am, I'd like to open an account." To which Stephanie giggled and told him he'd have to talk to an account executive to set that up, but she'd be happy to schedule an appointment for him. To hear her laughter and know that it had been a result of his presence, that sent Dan on a run of ecstasy throughout his mind. This brief high was only intensified as the two talked, sparing no subject or taboo in that office. He had been worried at first of his own awkward tendencies, that maybe he'd find himself silent and changing Stephanie's mind on him. But conversation just flowed so freely between them, and there was always so much more to be said. Around 11:30 that morning, Stephanie pulled up the website for Chipotle and put in her order, and then allowed Dan to input his as well. Dan stopped dead in his tracks once he looked at the screen. Stephanie had ordered the exact same bowl that he typically gets. Half chicken, half sofritas. "Whoa," he said, and now she smiled from behind him. "Another coincidence, I take it?" Stephanie said, as she multiplied her order by 2. Now, dear reader, I don't know if you've ever been in a serious relationship before or not, but when you find someone who enjoys the same things that you do, that is truly something beyond special. The way it usually works is that one will ask the other what they want, and their response is met with an hour of arguing over a place to eat. In the case of Dan and Stephanie, they had agreed on almost everything culinary save for 2 things. Dan liked red wine, and Stephanie had an illustrious relationship with dill pickles. Despite this, everything the two did together was seamlessly perfect. For the rest of the day, Stephanie would show Dan her set of tarot cards and begin to explain the meanings and interpretations of each of the major arcana. She was a witch, she had explained, and the tarot had actually warned her that Dan was coming into her life. Dan was fascinated to hear all of the wondrous happenings in the life of a witch. Up until now, Dan had considered himself an agnostic atheist, believing that there was nothing out there calling the shots. But to hear Stephanie speak on her own faith and beliefs, Dan couldn't help but fall deeper in love with her and with the craft. He dreamed of a day that they may hand fast, learning of the Sabbats and holidays that the pagans hold sacred, and deciding what better time to hold such a sacred union than on May Day, as the pagans believed that the Beltane holiday was one for lovers. He fell deeper into this dream as she spoke to him, her voice filling his head and lulling him upwards into a state of higher consciousness. He felt the power of this new knowledge permeate him, and he knew at that point that this was what he was meant to pursue. This was no ordinary casual affair, but an intricate plan of the universe, one that sought to see the two of them together in every lifetime. The phone rang and broke his concentration. Stephanie answered it after precisely 2 rings. No sooner, no later. Her dedication to precision and order seemed to go against everything that the two had been up to lately, at least on the surface. But this made Dan wonder just a little harder if she had been planning their future too, behind the scenes and running rampant through her mind with an air of a fresh linen after a hard rain. While waiting for their food to be delivered, Stephanie had the idea to run out to the nearby gas station to get something to drink. After running it by her boss, our pair took Dan's Jeep about a quarter-mile down the road. As they exited the vehicle and headed towards the storefront, a passerby coming the opposite direction dropped his receipt and some change while fumbling with his keys. Stephanie sprang into action, helping the man reclaim his lost coin, and the way she spoke to him throughout the encounter echoed virtues that Dan had thought were long forgotten by our selfish society. This woman was truly a work of art, her hair falling just perfect, eyes that could burn a hole through the heart but chose instead to greet it with a gentle warmth, and a fierce but truly amiable personality. Dan felt an unworthiness walking in her presence, and was clear in telling her that he didn't deserve her. She would always disagree, saying that she had chosen him for a reason. Our lovers returned to the accounting firm at the same time that their delivery driver had arrived with their food. A generous tip aside, the two ate, taking care not to set wet or warm items on Stephanie's elegant hardwood desk. They continued their insightful conversations on the universe, death, love, sex, and all those other mysterious things that we as lowly humans can't help but wonder about until it was time for Dan to leave. As they said their goodbyes, locked together once more, Stephanie stood tall on her toes and kissed Dan. She pulled back for a moment and looked into his eyes, smiling as she looked back at his lips and fell into them again. Stephanie had the voice of an angel on the karaoke set, and so it seemed the lips of one as well. Whispering so as not to cause any suspicion from the close-looming Scott, the two exchanged genuine, heartfelt, "I love you." Again, Dan trailed off to his car, this time unable to hide the overwhelming feeling of happiness that had taken up residence within him. Soon after hitting the road, he received a new Snapchat from his love. It was simply a chat that read, "Holy shit." He had just been thinking the same thing. Chapter 5. Haven't Had Enough. As it would turn out, once you've kissed your true love, it's hard to consider turning back. Dan still felt a bit encumbered with the thought of having betrayed a couple's wedding vows, and there was no doubt that Stephanie felt it too. However, neither of them had regretted it. After all, the only thing unregrettable in this short life we live is love. The conversations ramped up in steam once more, and before long there were more plans in place. This time, Stephanie would visit Dan at home on a Saturday. She would tell her husband that she was going to the apothecary, and even made sure to grab a few items and bags from home to make her story believable when she returned. Stephanie appeared with a ring of his recently repaired doorbell, and he had been eagerly awaiting her arrival. He invited her in, and they navigated their way to his bedroom almost immediately. Though still stricken with nervousness, the two mostly talked as they sat on his bed. "So, do you want to go on an adventure with me?" she asked him finally. "An adventure, eh? Where to?" "Well, I kind of told Justin I was going to the apothecary, and I figured since you're getting into that stuff, you might want to join me?" Disappointed but relieved at the same time, Dan agreed to the adventure, and from that point forward, any endeavor the pair would set out on would be referred to as such, an adventure. This time, they'd take Stephanie's car, and as Dan sat in her own personal space, he could feel her essence radiating through him. He smiled like a buffoon in that passenger seat, both of them singing along to pop-punk hits long since lost to anyone but them. The music would become one of the biggest things to bond them to each other. Lyrics and instrumentals interjecting throughout long and intense conversations at all hours of the day. He would sing for her in his spare time, propping his phone up against the TV and then eagerly awaiting her reaction once she watched the video. And now here they were, singing along to some old Good Charlotte song on the way to the local witchy store. It really is amazing what music can do to us, especially considering that Dan's singing voice had provoked Stephanie into several unsuccessful visits to the bar in the past just to see him again. Nevertheless, they were here now, and they were finally happy. Arriving at the apothecary, the two took a great amount of care in acting as if they were just friends, so as not to raise any alarm with the employees who had known of her and her husband. It felt wrong, but somehow the sneakiness of it all was thrilling in and of itself. As they entered the store, the reason Dan had recognized its name became apparent. At the counter stood another old high school friend of Dan's whose parents owned and operated the store. He was a shorter man of stockier build, but it fit him. Dan hadn't seen him in ages. "Hey, Timmy!" he shouted after recognizing his friend, startling both him and Stephanie. He walked to the counter to continue the conversation as Stephanie veered off into the corner to browse the selection of crystals. "Actually, I go by Tim now, man. How you been?" Well, not great lately, honestly, but you know what? Things are getting better." Dan tilted his head towards Stephanie, now paying no mind to the conversation at hand as she admired a piece of black tourmaline held much too close to her face. "I see. Well, welcome to the new store. We actually just finished moving about 2 weeks ago," Tim explained. "This is a hell of a place you guys got here, man. I remember the old store. You've come a long way," Dan said as he began to walk about the shop. Stephanie had since moved on to the boxes of shades bundles, and he slyly coiled his way over to her. An under-the-breath innuendo was exchanged between them, and they both burst into laughter, their faces lighting up redder than the rose hips and jars behind the counter. If it hadn't been obvious before, it sure was now. but Dan kept his promise to keep their relationship confidential and continued the conversation aptly as if nothing had happened. Tim began again, excited to tell tales of the future expansions to his family business. We're actually going to be building a Himalayan salt cave in one of the extra rooms in the back. Dude, this place is huge. You guys want to see? Dan and Stephanie both exchanged a look and then agreed to the facility tour. Among a classroom in which a support beam was decorated to look like a tree, the two were shown multiple parlors set up for psychic readings, personal scrying, and meets, a fully furnished kitchen, the future home of the salt cave, and several other large rooms. One of the rooms was actually a second, unused storefront that would eventually become the village head shop. As they walked the back rooms of the witch shop, several pieces of carpentry equipment and lumber lay strewn about. Yeah, it's kind of a work of progress back here, Tim interjected before falling back into his tour guide routine. Upon returning to the open floor of the apothecary, Dan found himself perusing the incense section and decided to make a purchase. He would return on his own the following week to ask advice on beginning his own craft. Once the transactions were complete, the two would talk to Tim for another half an hour before Dan remembered that he had another volunteer gig with the marching band to attend that night and needed to ready himself. Quickly, our lovers exited the store and proceeded to make commentary on the extended nature of Tim's conversationalism. He had always been like that, Dan said, but he didn't quite mind this time around as it had been so long since the two caught up. When Dan and Stephanie arrived back at Dan's house, neither moved to end the adventure there. Stephanie unfortunately had to go too soon to come inside, but not so quickly as to spare another 10 minutes with her love. Dan did have a festival to work that night, but he wasn't pressed to get there this early anyway. The two played with each other back and forth with a real baby it's cold outside vibe, except without all the creepy undertones. I really wish I could stay, but, she said to him, after giving him a smirk to show her intentions. As she looked away, Dan crept up behind her and whispered in her ear, saying, "But what if I did this?" Stephanie gasped, and then shuddered at the sound of his voice, his breath riding on the back of her neck just before pulling away and grinning at her from the passenger seat. She grabbed his shirt and pulled him in close, kissing him and running her hands through his hair. Still feeling cheeky and remembering a conversation they had had prior to this moment, Dan ran his hands through her hair as well, and with a fluid motion, he grabbed a handful and pulled her head back, looking at her now. Her expression had changed from playful to a deep, carnal desire, but the day ticks on and plans drew nearer for the both of them. While I would love to continue this, right now, you have Turkey Fest tonight. Well, yeah, but boy, get out of my car and go get ready, she laughed, pushing him while also unlocking the doors. Fine, he said, reluctantly pulling on the door handle before doubling back to kiss her again. I love you, and I love you. He smiled at his own reflection in the glass pane of his front door as she drove away, laughing to himself as he walked through into the living room. He plopped himself down on the couch, and after a moment of staring at the ceiling and a deep breath, a sigh of wow left his mouth. Chapter 6. So bad. The thing about magnets is that no matter how strong or weak they are, if you put them close enough together, they will always pull towards each other. When left alone to their own devices, magnets are docile in nature. Bring a second magnet into the picture, though, and the one that had been minding its business alone on the table will fly towards it when the time is right. All this, regardless of if another magnet was already attached to it or not. Physical science affects all of us on a daily basis, from gravity to G-force while driving your car to get your pumpkin spice latte. In Dan's line of work, physics was always at play. When you're working on cars, there's plenty of heavy lifting and tensile forces needed to get the job done right. Only now, Dan had been facing a new force in his daily routine, and that was the one of magnetic attraction to his phone. Dan and Stephanie would converse all day, every day. This somehow had actually improved Dan's productivity, and significantly at that. It's wondrous what a change of atmosphere and outlook may do for a person in such a situation, giving them the strength and gumption to crank out a few more hours for their pay log every day. Dan's conversations with Stephanie would never repeat, taking on new life from hour to hour and following the intertwined mess that both of their minds had come together to form. Through the whirlwind of subject hopping, Dan and Stephanie both agreed to make a playlist of songs that reminded them of each other and swapped lists for each other to listen to. Dan began wearing headphones at work, and the productivity increased even further. He had broken through his 80-hour deficit for the first time since airbag season, with Stephanie's help. In addition to his newfound success at work, Dan had also recruited a new roommate. A friend of his for quite a while, Jason would inhabit the basement of his home and help to help with bills and housework where needed. Things had finally begun to turn around for Dan, and before long, October had walked out the door without so much as a fight. Thrilled to have survived this brutal month, Dan heralded Stephanie's effect on him. It seemed that she had single-handedly worked out all of his life in so little time, untangling his juggle of a head and lighting a fire in the clearing for him to keep warm. Stephanie's birthday was fast approaching, and she had made it clear that she did not enjoy celebrating it. It was similar to her displeasure at the changing of the season. It reminded her of death. Stephanie had always had a fear of her own mortality, citing driving over bridges as one of the biggest culprits. In addition, she had also hinted that maybe her birthday just never seemed important to anyone else, and so there was no point in making a big deal out of it. Despite this, Stephanie was having a birthday party at the bar the weekend before her big day. Now, the pair had grown so close over their short time together that waiting until that party to meet up again seemed an impossible feat, and so in the 2 weeks before the party, they would hang out several times. Stephanie's sister, who happened to live directly across the street from Dan's mother, would dedicate a few hours every Wednesday to spending some time with her siblings. They called this tradition Sister Day, and almost every week it was a success. Stephanie would leave Sister Day and head directly to Dan's house for the first time on the 6th of November, and the two enjoyed each other's company for the little time that they could spend together before Stephanie had to return back home to her family. This encounter was menial, but to Dan it meant the world that she would spend her time and waste her gas just to come and see him for a few minutes. However, their next encounter would escalate things even further. Stephanie's husband was the owner of a roofing company, and sometimes he had to work on the weekends. She, holding a desk job that ran parallel to the stock market, would always have these days alone with her daughter. On the following Sunday, Stephanie waited for her husband to leave and then dropped her daughter off at her sister's house, heading over to see Dan. The two would be alone this time, and for several hours. With the conversations that they'd been having lately, it was clear what would happen when she arrived. Directing themselves into the bedroom once again, the carnal desire that had been building up since their first encounter was unleashed in a wave of stray clothing. Dan kissed her neck as he caressed the small of her back, and she gasped again at his touch. He would dig his fingernails into her skin, sinking his teeth into her as he felt her writhe and recoil beneath him. The clothing continued to pour off of them piece by piece, and then Stephanie would push him over and climb on top of him. She had decided that she was calling the shots this time, but Dan knew that the power his hands and voice held over her was much too strong to be contained. They had both eagerly expressed their interest in rather kinky foreplay, and so as she sat there thinking she had won, Dan reached up to cup her throat and squeezed the outsides of her neck, drawing her down into submission. Reclaiming his top position after flipping her over on her back, Dan would place each of her ankles onto his respective shoulders, and thus the two danced a lover's waltz. As he pushed himself deeper into her body, he could feel that they were becoming one beast, one heart, one soul. His mind ran 1,000,000 miles out and back, connecting with something primal and yet untapped in the far reaches of the universe. Never before in his life had he experienced anything close to this sensation, a feeling of welcoming someone else into his own domain. Stephanie began to shake, her cries and shouts of pleasure filling the dense air around them with her first orgasm, and Dan let up the intensity to allow her the chance to recover. He would lean in and kiss her neck as she struggled to catch her breath between labored shudders. He wrapped his arms around hers, placing his hands on top of her head so that he could play with her hair, his lips meeting hers as if they had planned it beforehand. When Dan finally reached his climax, his conscious mind exploded with the knowledge of 1,000 elders. His body in overdrive and yet somehow also shutting down at the same time, his eyes rolled back in his head. Stephanie had orgasmed as well, tightening herself around Dan and convulsing, her back arched away from the mattress. The two had not noticed that they had broken both his bed frame and box spring, nor that poor Jason was now scarred for life in the room just below them. When Dan was finally able to speak again, he had been caressing her for only a few minutes. A playful laughter started out low and grew between them both. They held each other a little tighter as Dan looked into her eyes and whispered, "Stephanie, I love you." I love you back, babe. That was amazing, she said in response. Literally mind blowing. Like, I think I spoke to God himself, he answered, tickling her sides with his fingers. She always hated that, but it never failed to make her smile. They had always assumed this would happen, of course. Sex is a natural part of any relationship, but they had lied to themselves in saying that it would be a one-off kind of deal. Neither of them had expected their relationship to blossom into something so beautiful, and they sure as hell never saw it coming that their sexual encounter would rearrange the very workings of their souls. Something like that will always leave you wanting more. And so, the magnets had finally collided with each other. Dan spent all the time he could with Stephanie that day, just laying in bed and pillow talking, eventually dressing each other back up and migrating out into the living room. Before long, though, Dan had a family function to attend to, and he hugged his lover a little harder this time as they said goodbye. That night, Dan would have vivid dreams that made little sense to him, but felt important somehow. The dreams all correlated to each other, and it felt as if there was a message being communicated to him that he just couldn't seem to crack. Finally making an intimate connection with Stephanie had awoken something wonderful inside of him, yet it remained unrealized for now. Chapter 7. And make it real, or else forget about it. I'll spare you the details of their next few sexual encounters, dear reader. After all, this is a story about love, not making love. It had become rather commonplace for them, though, as Stephanie began to visit Dan every Wednesday night and Sunday morning, and Dan would venture up north to Houston to visit her at her solitary day job every Friday. To sum it up in one sentence, the two of them would leave no surface untouched. Now it was the 16th of November, just a few days before Stephanie's actual birthday, and her party was just a few short hours away. Our lovers had begun to exchange love notes at each of their encounters, an elementary way of giving mementos to remember each other while they were apart. Dan had one prepared for Stephanie this night, but his nerves were working overtime this time around. One does not simply have a birthday party without inviting one's spouse, after all, but Stephanie had assured him over and over again that it would be fine. Upon arriving at the bar, Dan began to panic. He, Jason, and one of Jason's friends, Xavier, were staked out front in the Jeep, picking clean a dinner box from the local McDonald's drive-thru. What if Justin had found out? What if he walked in to discover a gun pointed at his face? Ironically now, Dan was actually concerned about his own demise when a few short months ago he himself had started to bring it about. After a moment, he saw the Equinox pull into the parking lot, and once another beat had passed, the wedded couple would walk past his car. She looked back at him as she entered the bar, rolling her eyes and smiling at his panicked expression. Her lack of urgency in this situation would help to calm him down, and after another moment of gathering himself, he and his friends would follow suit. He walked into the bar and acted surprised to see her, hugging her and asking her how she had been. He would keep this interaction short so that wandering eyes and whispering voices would be kept to a minimum, and took his usual place at the corner of the bar as Stephanie and Justin sat near the pool tables. Before long, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Stephanie had sent him a new message, asking him if he'd like to meet her at her car. He agreed, quickly coordinating which exit each of them would take to avoid suspicion. When she received his message, she gave her husband, shit you not, a high five, and walked out of the bar. Dan chuckled to himself as he conjured thoughts of the lack of passion or desire between them that would spark such an anticlimactic parting, but quickly exited the back door and made his way around the building to find Stephanie pretending to dig around in her back seat. He came up behind her and grabbed her hips, and she spun around to meet him with a kiss. The two would go back and forth requesting these rendezvous from each other for most of the night, sneaking around under the noses of her friends, family, and husband to connect again and speak on how the occasion was going. Dan had also prepared a list of her favorite songs to sing for karaoke that night, and unfortunately what happened next would cut the event short. Dan and Stephanie had both always been ones to close the bar, as they call it. Being that this was her birthday party, no one expected any less from her, and Dan planned on sticking around to the 2:30 bell. Now, Justin, he was already painted in a poor light in Dan's eyes. There had to have been some good qualities about the guy if Stephanie had chosen to stay with him this long, right? Any inkling of that thought had faded in Dan's mind as he watched Justin go from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde in the course of about 4 beers and a shot of whiskey. Justin would begin to yell over the smallest things, gaining traction in his belligerence as he worked all the way up to personal matters such as the two's financial situations. Stephanie's night had been ruined at his hands, and only about halfway through Dan's song list, she left. Dan received a chat a few minutes later as she only lived about 2 blocks away from the bar, and poor Stephanie was in shambles. She would unload and vent to Dan as he headed home for the night about how she just couldn't take this anymore. Oh, how tired she was of the way he treated her, and just how much happier she was with Dan around. Dan did his best to console her, drawing from similar experiences he had had in the past, and eventually she fell asleep on the couch with a smile on her face once more. While Dan was relieved that his words had calmed her, he was now fuming that her husband would treat her in such a way for her birthday. He now truly believed that with what was to come, the man would get what he deserved. Dan put himself to bed, still furious at the altercation, but still hopeful, as he had plans to see Stephanie the following morning. Of course, following their routine, she'd wait for Justin to go to work, drop the kid off, and come to Dan's house. This time, they'd start out on the couch, having a very important conversation about what happened the night before. Dan offered her advice, saying that maybe her and her husband should take on marriage counseling. "I don't need that. What I need is a divorce," she said. About 30 seconds following this, her phone rang and Justin was calling her. Dan couldn't make out what the conversation was about, but it was short, and he noticed they did not say "I love you" at the end. What a shame, but all the better for him. It seemed this overarching universal plan that he found himself a part of was falling perfectly into place. Before long, the two moved into Dan's bedroom once again, still talking about the previous night, when Stephanie made it clear that she was starting to get more comfortable with their situation. "So Rhiannon kept asking me who I was Snapchatting," she said. Terrified that someone had caught on to their love affair, Dan's only response would be, And at first I was just like, "Jessica," because I was Snapchatting Jessica too, because she was coming, Stephanie continued. "And then she showed up," Dan said, finishing her thought. "Yeah, and then she showed up, and I kept Snapchatting." She began to laugh, and its contagiousness infected Dan as well. And then Rhiannon goes, "Now who are you Snapchatting?" And I was like, Ashley? So we Snapchatted Ashley, even though I wasn't Snapchatting Ashley, but that's fine. Now she was hysterical at her own antics, and Dan couldn't help but grin as she recounted the story. And then finally I was just like, "Dude, listen. Shh." And the two lost their marbles once more, taking a moment to laugh before the story continued. And then, oh my God, I wanted to hit her. She's like, "Every time you look at your phone, I check to see if he looks at his phone." She laughed once more, filling the room up with an air of lightheartedness. So yeah, that happened," she said, finally wrapping up her story. Dan laughed once more at just how clever this encounter had been behind the scenes and saying, "Fun and dangerous," as a way to recap the last night's event. "It was great. I'm not going to lie. I loved it," she said, and Dan began to recall his experiences as well. "Dude, I was so worried. Like, I sat in that Jeep." "Why are you yelling?" she asked, and it was true. He was yelling. "Because I'm Italian. It's what we do," he answered, garnering another playful chuckle from the girl. "So I sat in the Jeep," he whispered. "You don't need to whisper, though, like you can talk," she said, poking fun at him. "And I thought, what if he's known the whole time and he just hasn't said anything, and he's waiting for me to walk in the door to shoot me?" Dan said, still whispering. He broke his whisper for the next part. "And then he didn't. So I was like, okay, step 1 is complete. I'm in." Stephanie laughed again at how covert ops Dan had chosen to make this event. "Step 2, don't get noticed." Then he goes, "Excuse me, sir." And I'm like, "Fuck, I'm noticed," Dan said, referring to a close brush that he had had with Justin during her party. "But not really," Stephanie said, now finishing his thought, as he had done so many times before, and again laughing at his over-thoughtful execution of a birthday party. "Stop it," he whined. "Stop what?" she asked him. "Laughing at me. You're so laughing at me. You are so laughing at me," he said, arguing with her now. The argument was playful, though, and barely lasted 5 seconds. "No, I'm not. I'm smiling at you because I love your face," she said. "Well, I love your face," he said, and they shared a kiss. Stephanie would tickle him, and he'd tickle her back. Then the story goes back into something that we're not discussing. Refer to Chapter 6 if you must. After getting dressed again, they had decided there would be another adventure. This time, the two would venture up to Coshocton Falls to the nearest bookstore for a coffee date. On the car ride up, they had discussed the possibility of a sleepover. This was a typical topic for their conversations, but an idea had been sparked in Stephanie's brain this time. Well, Justin's going on a hunting trip right after Thanksgiving, and he isn't going to be back until that Sunday, if you wanted to stay at my house one night, Stephanie said, poking him in the side. This seemed to be the riskiest of all the moves he could make, but he did enjoy being in her space, and he would love to wake up next to her just to see how it feels. And so, the plan was set. Our pair arrived at the bookstore, heading inside and browsing through the month's bestsellers at the forefront of the store. Stephanie picked up a poetry book with a jellyfish on the front, entitled Pillow Thoughts, and written by Courtney Peppernell. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes began to tear up, and the occasional, "Look at this," or "This has to be written about us," before she would hand the book to Dan on another new page. If she hadn't known better, she'd swear up and down that Courtney Peppernell was Dan's nom de plume, and that he had penned the book about her. She decided to purchase the book, and she'd take it home, read it cover to cover, and mark all of the pages that reminded her of Dan with a heart before allowing him to borrow it. The two ordered their drinks from the coffee shop inside the bookstore and waited. Stephanie still flipping through the pages of her new book, and Dan smiling as he watched her get whisked away into the world of the literary. The drinks were served, and they sat at a table discussing their plans for the sleepover. The coffee was awful, dear reader, but they didn't care, save for it being the butt of a few jokes. They'd venture back to Dan's house after stopping for food, and that would be the end of their coffee date. Stephanie had made mention that the bookstore was one of her favorite places, and Dan felt enchanted and honored to have been taken there by her. He had never seen a bookstore in such an ethereal light before, but now it seemed to call to him. He felt drawn to all the things that she loved, and it opened up new worlds for him, from different music he'd never heard before, to witchcraft, to reading for the first time since his senior year of high school. Dan's life continued to enrich itself through the powers of this beautiful girl he called his love. Chapter 8. And Eyes That Would Burn. Aside from a few other late-night encounters, including one special date at Dan's favorite pizza place, our pair would be dying to get to the night of Black Friday. This was the night that they decided the sleepover would be held on, and the anticipation left both of them struggling to get to sleep for days prior. Thanksgiving came, and Stephanie was tucked away in far Richmond, celebrating with her husband's family. Dan would find himself in the Coshocton Valley National Park, celebrating with family friends that he couldn't quite stand to be around. The two of them both had wished that they could be with each other instead. As Thanksgiving came to a close and they both lay in separate beds, they had texted back and forth, daring each other to be the first to go to sleep. The conversation lasted well into the wee hours of the morning, with cries of, "I'm so excited for tomorrow night," echoing in between more thoughtful dialogue. The next night, Dan would have his evening shower a little early and put on pajamas for the first time since his childhood. If he was going to have a sleepover, he was sure going to make sure that he'd sell it. The plan was simple. Stephanie's home was fitted with security measures that linked up to both her and her husband's phone, and so when Dan arrived, he'd park down the street and alert Stephanie. Stephanie, being a genius, would reset the Wi-Fi router, giving Dan roughly 2 minutes to sneak past the front door cameras and inside while the internet was offline. And from that point on, they'd just have to be careful not to wake her sleeping daughter upstairs. Now, Dan had to work the next day, and he was already made well aware that he'd have to leave long before Stephanie's daughter woke up, but that seemed no problem. Without a hitch, the plan fell perfectly into place. Dan was now standing in this living room of hers, a couch pushed up against the wall adjacent to him and the walls adorned with dozens of family photos. It should have bothered him, being surrounded by the photographed face of the man whose marriage he was desecrating, but Dan was overwhelmingly ecstatic to even have made it this far. Stephanie would suggest after a while that the two step out back to smoke some weed, and Dan had not obliged an offer like this for quite some time, but being that it was one of the things that Stephanie liked to do, he agreed to share the experience with her. The two smoked on the back deck, talking about how crazy it was that he was inside her house. The hospitality Stephanie would provide made Dan think fondly of a future that they'd have together, a large house in the suburbs or maybe a more rural area. Her daughter running down the stairs each morning to join them for breakfast. It seemed like this had all been predetermined, already figured out by the universe itself. Dan was steadfast in his belief that they would end up married and handfasted for the rest of their days. Lying on the couch, Dan wrapped himself around Stephanie as the drugs began to kick in. They were watching ridiculousness when Stephanie's breathing began to pick up, and soon she seemed to be sighing in nervousness. Dan adjusted himself to look at her, but she did not turn to meet his eyes. "What's wrong, love?" he asked her. Nothing, just go to sleep. It'll be fine, she assured him, but at this point Dan knew her well enough to know that it was not, because she had never been this way before. Listen, I'm really high and it's fucking with me right now. Are you upset with me? He prodded, hoping for some reassurance. No, she began to tear up. It's just a lot, you being here. Her ironclad defense was crumbling now, and she could not lie to Dan. He should not have come here. The two knew that this was a bad idea, but had chosen to take it on anyway. Dan even offered to have Stephanie stay at his house if she could find a sitter, but she insisted on this way. Unfortunately now, though, they found themselves in a dire situation. This revelation hurts Dan's spirit, but he understood the sentiment behind it. After all, her and her husband had lived in this house together for 5 years. Regardless of if their relationship felt right or not, having him in her home was not an easy pill to swallow. Earnestly, he offered to Uber himself home and come back to pick up the Jeep in the morning. Despite her insistence that she'd be fine, he ordered an Uber anyway, and when it showed up, Stephanie thanked him and shut the internet down again so that he could leave. The dynamic hadn't changed in our duo's relationship until the following weekend when Dan visited his mother. Everything went relatively well until Dan's sister decided to be nosy and looked Stephanie up on Facebook. Instead of texting Dan, she sent a message to their mother, and what followed was an hour-long conversation about how low his self-esteem must be to be trailing a married woman. And it was. But he knew in his heart that what they were doing was the right thing for both of them. He had made and immediately broken a promise to his mom to stop talking to her, but her knowledge on the matter raised a new concern. Tina, Stephanie's sister, lived directly across the street from her, and in recent months the two had been feuding over a fender bender between her boyfriend and the neighbor. It was unlikely at best, but Dan feared that she may tell Tina what her sister had been up to. He relayed this fear to Stephanie when he got home, and she ended the conversation by saying that their relationship had officially become too much for her, and it would be best if they split up. Dan, devastated but hopeful, knew at this point that Stephanie would be back. He left her alone for the greater part of the next day, but made sure to keep the snap streak going. By the end of the next week, the two were back together and in full swing. This didn't last quite as long the second time around, though, because Dan had noticed she was reserving herself in conversations now as compared to how she was prior. After another subsequent breakup and get-together, Dan assured her that he made his mom swear to never tell Tina, and the relationship flourished once more. Now, into the later part of December, another house party of Dan's came and went, and the two would spend a portion of Christmas Eve together at Dan's house. Amused that both of them had enjoyed separately before meeting each other, the art of wax seals was the subject of Stephanie's gift to him. She had gotten him a starter kit to create his own wax seals, with several tea light candles strewn about under the plastic inside the box. Dan had a passion for theatrics, and during their second breakup, he had purchased Stephanie the rights to a star located in her birth constellation of Scorpius, with a note that read as follows. Given our circumstance, I told you I would fetch you the moon and the stars at a moment's notice. I told you that you deserve everything that the sky has to offer. Well, it's not much, but it's a start. Consider this me making good on a promise I made to you. Drawn from the constellation Scorpio, this star that bears your name will forever be a part of the night sky and forever a part of you as well. After all, we are all just made of crazy space just like the stars. I haven't been able to secure the entire sky for you, nor the earth, but I hope that next time you gaze up at those stars, you know that at least one of them is looking back at you, and I hope you remember that I am the reason. Whether we were meant to be or not, you are the love of my life, and I will always regret not being able to give you everything you deserve. So, here's a sliver of the universe that you, as a goddess, should have reign over. Treat it with as much kindness, respect, dignity, and trust as you instilled in me. You will forever hold a part of my heart and soul, whether fate finds us together or not. Despite what I said and how it ended, I still hold out hope that things can change. Never forget me. Never forget how I made you feel in your own skin. Merry Christmas, my beautiful Stephanie Michelle, and good night. Tears had begun to flow from the moment she opened the stiff manila envelope that held her certificate of ownership, and reading such a heartfelt letter didn't make it any easier to stop. She loved him, and she loved her gift. Dan would start sealing his love notes with wax using his, and played with the kit for the next several days, making different colored seals using wax pellets in a glass jar that she had gotten him. Among these gifts, he also found a bundle of envelopes, each for him to open at different times. There was an envelope for Dan to open when he was happy. There was one for when he was sad. There was one for when he needed a reminder of just how much his Stephanie loved him. Above all, this was the most heartfelt gift that anyone had ever gotten for him. He cried at the thought, wiping the tears quickly to hide them from his love. He couldn't wait to see her again, as their time together on the eve of the holiday was drawing to a close. Stephanie told him that she'd be making an appearance at the bar for New Year's Eve. Eager to kiss his love at midnight, he suggested that the two dress up to the nines for the event since it would be the turn of the decade. New Year's was an extra special holiday for them too, as their song was aptly named after it. New Year's Project, originally by Further Seems Forever and covered by Mayday Parade, was the anthem of their relationship. And it was always agreed upon that in the next year, Stephanie would get everything together to become his true boyfriend, saying, "One day in the not-so-distant future, I'll be able to love you loudly." On the night of December 31st, Dan sported a suit adorned with a peacoat and topped it off with an old-school wide-brimmed fedora. Stephanie had chosen an elegant cocktail dress and accessorized herself with various crystalline necklaces whose envious touch lay ever swaying upon her chest. The two would hash out the same plan that they had concocted for her birthday party, as Justin was present for this occasion too. She'd send him chats telling him how badly she wished she could go home with him instead, or at least sneak away for an hour or two to show him her love. At midnight, as the countdown ended, Dan watched as Justin intoxicatedly tried to kiss his wife, and though he had been successful, Stephanie did not seem about it. She quickly exited the building to the rear and wrapped her arms around Dan's neck, kissing him several times under the light of the full moon. Of all the encounters that the two had shared up to this point, this one felt to be the most magical. It was now 2020, and the New Year's project was underway. He desperately sought to make her his own in that moment, and he believed that this would truly be the year and the decade for their lives to finally turn around for the better together. Chapter 9. Don't You Love the Life You Killed? When it came to her daughter, Stephanie might have been one of the best mothers that Dan had ever come across. This proved true again during winter break when her daughter was home from school and Stephanie would spend most of her free time with her. Never did it bother Dan, though he had begun to notice that their midday lunches at her workplace were becoming scarcer. During this time, though, they'd find other times that they could get together and make it work. Stephanie had to have her daughter to school by 8 o'clock a.m., and didn't have to be at work until 8:30. So if she dropped her daughter off early, the two could meet up for morning coffee and a chat on Mondays, when Dan didn't have to be at work until 10, but got up anyway to see her. One brisk Monday morning in the middle of January, Stephanie had made her way to Dan's house to see him before work, and the conversation had led to the bedroom. As his hands wandered, though, hers would meet them to pull them away. When he opened his eyes, he could see that the life in hers was faltering. She turned away from him and faced the window, draped with a blind to keep the rising sun from picking away at sleeping eyes. "What's the matter?" he finally asked her. Through broken will and hollowed nightmares came her next words. "This just doesn't feel right anymore." The death sentence that had just been placed on their relationship grew nearer as her eyes began to flow with sorrow, and he knew that it was only a matter of time until the end reached his doorstep. Still focused on keeping her happy, he'd assure her that it was okay and that he understood the moral dilemma that she was going through. He hugged her tightly, and the tears continued to march from her now closed eyes. Abruptly ending the encounter, Stephanie left that morning without telling him that she loved him, but hurriedly apologized for the encounter over Snapchat. When asked if it would ever feel right again, she answered, "I don't know." The dynamic had shifted dramatically at this point, with Dan aware of the looming end to come and Stephanie fighting with herself in her own mind. Conversations grew shorter and less involved until Thursday that week. Dan knew that The Middle by Jimmy Eat World was a song that really helped cheer her up when she was in shambles, and it had been the way that they had met those years ago. He recorded a surprise video of himself singing it for her, and after thanking him, the conversation began. She thought that it would be best if they stopped seeing each other, and Dan understood, though his heart sank through the seat of his pants. Just a short 2 weeks prior, they had adopted a new term for each other that would make this that much harder on him. Now, soulmates are a special thing to come by in this world, but nowadays, with all the souls wandering about in their corporeal form, they're a dime a dozen. This was something beyond that, and through a conveniently placed advertisement on his Facebook feed, Dan would discover the idea of twin flames. Essentially, they're like soulmates on crack cocaine. The same soul split evenly into two separate pieces and placed into bodies at the same time on the terrestrial plane to find each other in life. When Dan had shared the article with Stephanie, she legitimately asked him if he had been the one who wrote it because it had described their dynamic to a T. And now it seemed that maybe they weren't meant to be lovers, but maybe best friends. The fatal blow wouldn't come until the next day. Stephanie had enough respect for Dan at this point to give him a proper, in-person breakup. They knew that this was it this time, and Stephanie would need to focus on getting her home life back up to code. Thus, they'd meet for lunch at Stephanie's place of business one last time to make it official. Dan had stopped on his way there to pick up Chick-fil-A, her favorite food, though he hated the stuff, and ate with her. However, an account executive at the firm who had been on extended medical leave had returned to work since the last time he'd been there, and so the plan was thwarted in the face of a lack of confidentiality. They agreed at that time that Stephanie would stop at Dan's house on her way home from work to seal the deal. Dan waited those loom-stretched hours that felt like days in the desert for his love to come and crush him, and the time had finally arrived. Her Equinox was parked outside, and she made her way up the driveway for the last time. Surprisingly, though, Dan remained credulous in their promise to stay best friends, and so he was unbothered by this ending closing in. They'd sit on the couch and talk about it for a while, every now and again, Stephanie tearing up and Dan hugging her to console her, until finally the deed was done. Thank you for everything. This has to be a record for the healthiest breakup in the history of forever, she said. There's no need to make this bad for either of us. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. Promise? She asked, eyes still gleaming. I promise, and I love you. She kissed him, twice actually, and left. For the most part, it seemed like Stephanie's mood had significantly improved at this point. She was happy again, and though he could no longer be the source of her happiness, Dan was happy for her. Their conversations went back to the way they were, without any risky or obscene topics, and this was great at first until Dan found himself missing her touch and her cleverness. The first stage of grieving had set in, and Stephanie had begun to feel it too. Things began to change then, as she'd pull herself away from conversations with a new air of apathy setting in at his condition. Dan would turn to more intense forms of witchcraft, conjuring divinations and seeking the help of an evidential psychic medium. They'd meet on a Friday when Dan was off work, and the session would begin as any other session. Dan's grandpa, great-grandma, and childhood friend who had died in a car accident 8 years prior all came through to speak through Chris. After speaking of Dan's past relationships and delving into future jobs and financial situations, Chris paused for a moment and then said, "That's incredible. I don't usually get this one. I don't know if I should say it." Cautious at his first encounter with the medium, Dan was silent at this. Chris continued, "Have you ever heard of a twin flame?" Dan's heart sank at the same time that his mind lit up in a chorus of floral buds. He had been right about Stephanie all along, and it was only a matter of time before she'd be his again. Chris explained that while a relationship was already there and it would be quite a while before anything serious or official could come of it. Anywhere from 2 years away to 15, and it all just depended on other factors opening back up to each other. If there was any doubt in Dan's mind before about the validity of a psychic, it had been voided with this information. He would take this reading in its entirety and share it with Stephanie, hoping that it may give her strength and courage. Instead of sweeping her off of her feet and sitting as the gospel does, though, the news struck a wave of disappointment in Stephanie. She had changed a lot in such a short amount of time. "Listen, I need you to look at this as a friendship rather than a future relationship for my own sake. I'm happier than I've been in a long time," she said. "I mean, that's fine, but look at the reading. I'm not making this up," he answered, hurt to have been reduced to such a menial status. "I don't believe in long-term readings like that. So much can change between now and then." Yes, but if it's destined, you know I don't do destiny. Just be my friend, please. But he would continue working on this destiny in the darkness, divining exact dates for major events in their lives through the use of a pendulum. The pendulum swayed back and forth, suspended between his index finger and thumb. At the advent of a question, the pendulum would begin to swing over top of letters and numbers laid out on a map beneath it, spelling out an answer. When asked if Stephanie and he would ever get back together again, the pendulum responded, yes. When asked if Justin and Stephanie would break up, the pendulum responded, yes. When asked whose fault the breakup would be, the pendulum responded, Justin. When asked what he had done or will do to cause this, the pendulum responded, unsavory. Shaken at this new knowledge that he'd inevitably keep to himself, Dan was now comforted in the fact that the universe still had plans for them. Whether or not she was willing to see the plan was only a matter of time, as it was happening whether she was ready or not. Intrigued, though, Dan would go on to ask deeper questions with more specific answers. When asked when they would break up, the pendulum responded, February 14. Valentine's Day, though not specifying a year. When asked when Dan and Stephanie would be wed, the pendulum responded, October. Real funny. Do you actually know, or are you just dicking with me? Can I have a specific date? He asked, now pleading. The pendulum again responded, this time clarifying. October 12, 2022. So, all he'd have to do then is wait it out, staying close by to comfort her in times of need and making sure she'd never lose the energy that he'd held on to with her for so long. Falling into late January, Dan would find himself more and more upset with Stephanie's newfound lack of passion in their conversations. He'd ask her what was wrong, and finally she spoke up. Look, I know you're not going to want to hear this, but just hear me out. It helped me out a lot, and it might help you too. I did a cord cutting spell on you a little while ago, and I can honestly say that I'm 100% okay with this now. I was in a really bad place mentally, and I wanted you back so bad, but now it's like it doesn't even bother me anymore. It's like the switch flipped. Maybe give that a try. Heartbroken to have fallen victim to her witchcraft, the very thing that she had introduced him, Dan sobbed. He cried himself to sleep that night, knowing that the bond had been broken, and thinking back, he could pinpoint exactly when it happened, too. He felt it earlier that week, but couldn't explain what it was. All of this was starting to make Dan question the past, and various scenarios began to play in his mind. Ultimately, he'd stick by the divination that he had received, and he'd continue to talk to Stephanie despite the blatant lack of care she'd begun to exhibit towards him. Toward the beginning of February, Stephanie announced that she was taking a trip to Virginia to see her father. At first, she said that Justin had opted to stay behind for a child's birthday party that was supposedly happening a month after the birthday. Skeptical, Dan went to work envisioning that Justin was cheating on her and would use this time to get together with his mistress. The date that she was slated to leave was February 14th. Now the day came and passed, and no news of tragedy had reached his way back home. Dan was now discouraged, but remembered the lack of a year for this destiny. On February 15th, however, it was made clear that things were not playing out how they'd hoped they would. The snap streak that they had had since the day that they met back in October would be broken, and from that point forward, Dan would only receive text chats from her. No more would pictures of her radiant face grace his phone screen throughout the day. Chapter 10. Welcome to the Fallout. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, not very many of us felt it at first. It started out slow, as if a pot of water was coming to a boil, slowly heating up until the bubbles began to roll up the sides of the pot. Well into March is when things began to fall uncertain, as schools and businesses would close for fear of spreading and contracting this new plague. It was only a matter of time before a full-scale government-mandated shutdown of businesses would take place. It started out with the bars and restaurants. Now, with nowhere to spend his free time and struggling with this new heartache, Dan would turn to songwriting even more. In February, he had been looking into purchasing an autographed lyric sheet for one of Stephanie's favorite songs, and in doing so, he stumbled upon the email address of the lead singer. Bradley was offering vocal lessons, and Dan decided that it would be a great opportunity for him to take up a new hobby in order to distract himself. As COVID-19 brought the curtains crashing down on his career as an automotive technician for the time being, he'd continue working closely with Bradley, who had told him from the beginning that he was by far his most talented student. Despite this, Dan continued to spiral deeper into depression in the face of a failed twin flame relationship. He began to cover songs on Facebook and then YouTube. He talked to Stephanie less and less because the direction of conversations was starting to eat him alive, and in this time he began to cover some very sad, heartbreaking songs. In his spare time, given that the pandemic had landed him at home 24 hours a day, he'd also write poetry and would find that most of his songs and poems were all about her. He'd post the following on Facebook one April evening. I made espresso tonight, for the first time since the last time you were here. I wonder if you remember how it tasted, the way I burned it as I talked to you instead of tending to the stove. I wonder if you remember anything at all of that morning. Even using the pot now brings back memories I don't care to harbor, and the calcium built up inside of it shows just how much things can change over a short period of time. I made espresso tonight. As the days stretched on, Dan would start playing video games again with buddies from high school, but one night again he found himself staring into the eyes of death. Heartbroken, jobless, hopeless, he'd again decide that enough was enough. And on the night of April 10th, unbeknownst to anyone but himself, Dan would swallow an entire bottle of his antidepressants in hopes that he would die in his sleep. After doing this, he felt no remorse for himself and played another 3 hours of Call of Duty with his friends before signing off as if nothing had happened. As he lay down late that night to sleep, he'd think, "This is it," and close his eyes. The universe had other plans for Dan, and at roughly 6:30 in the morning, he would wake up having a violent seizure. He could not see, but he felt himself convulsing. He could not hear, but he knew that inside he was screaming for help. As the convulsions subsided, Dan would shaken-handedly open his phone and decided that for help he'd text Stephanie. She'd know what to do after all, and he trusted her more than anyone else. "Please help me. I think I'm having a seizure and I don't know what to do. I'm terrified." "Well, you need to go to the hospital. Don't die." Shaken sober and yet still shaking from his condition, Dan wondered why she'd been so cold. And then another message came for him. "Listen, can I be honest with you?" "You can always be honest with me," he'd reply. "I feel like you're guilt-tripping me, and it's not okay." "Where did you get that from? You're really going to do this right now?" "You're posting specifically targeted cover songs about me on Facebook, and that post about making espresso, you don't get to decide how I feel. You don't know what's going on through my head. That's for me to decide." "Well, if you really feel that way, you know how I feel about being called manipulative. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'll remove you on Facebook, and I'll take you off of my Snapchat, and I'll leave you alone for a while. When you're ready to come back, I'll be here, and you have my phone number. Does that sound okay?" Crying his way through another episode, Dan would come back to consciousness to find that she had never responded. "Please tell me if that's okay. I need to know how to proceed with this," he sent. "That's fine," she answered. And that was that. After exactly 6 months of her being in his life, she was gone. Now more alone than ever before, Dan needed to find something to keep him busy. He'd call up his best friend and head over to his house and sit and talk about all that had happened. Though this didn't help, and Dan would continue to fall deeper into madness with each passing day. He went from wondering when she'd text him to if she'd ever text him at all. Days turned into weeks, and before he knew it, Dan was being called back into work. For being behind the wheel for the first time in a month, Dan was rather calm and collected as he drove into work that day. But as he passed by a maroon Equinox, his hands would betray him and pull the wheel out from under his grasp. Lucky to have caught control of the vehicle before hitting a curb or another car, he knew this would be a big problem. Why was he scared of her? Why did he dread seeing her on the road? As time ticked by, he began to realize that other places and things would trigger these panic attacks too. The local Acme that they'd go shopping at together was entirely off limits. Route 8 northbound, the road he used to take to visit her for lunch, was to be avoided at all costs, especially during those hours that he knew she'd be driving to and from work. A handful of other places crossed his mind as well before he eventually landed himself on the kingpin of the whole ordeal, the bar. Stephanie had been going to the bar for much longer than he had, but she was less of a regular customer than he. Regardless of this, though, Dan decided that this was her bar before it was his, and though it wasn't open yet in light of the rapidly declining state of the world, he made peace with never returning there so that she could have it. Weeks turned into months, and Dan would swing wildly between sorrowfully missing his partner and swearing he was angry at her. It was the days filled with malice that were easier on him, but he knew that they would be short-lived. He always returned to the sadness, and it would always consume him further with each occurrence. Chapter 11. When Berenstein Was Fine. The days would begin to grow longer for Dan, and as Stephanie began to matter less and less, he'd focus on his other endeavors, though he still kept her subconsciously tucked away. He'd ponder each of their respective situations any time he was working, wondering why he was not good enough, why she would flip like this, why things had to play out the way that they did. His music hobby had really taken off with Bradley's help, and for the anniversary of the date that they had started talking, Dan had decided to produce a music video. Still months away, he got to work writing, engineering, and scripting. Before long, the pagan Sabbath of Litha was right around the corner. Now going to become great friends with the owners of the apothecary, Dan would be invited to their Litha Fest, which was an overnight camping trip dedicated to celebrating the holiday. A friend of his by the name of Tylee would share the tent with him, and during this time they hashed out a plan to have her featured as the female lead in the music video. He wanted to play on the feeling of a split universe, one where they had lasted and endured, and the other where he had found himself reveling in currently. He'd begin by finding the perfect lyrics. You were always searching for deliverance, blatant misconceptions that you make. My overall perception of this dream is that I'll die before I wake. At another place in time, you were infinitely mine, relatively all right when Berenstein was fine. At another place in time, only parallel to mine, the universe was all right when Berenstein was fine. You were always certain that it did exist. An imagination so intrinsic, all at stake. All the things we said when we were younger, did it bend or did I break? Wait for me there. I'll die if you die, wait for me, I swear. Wait for me, I'm still somewhere. You're getting older without me, I'm scared. Now, complete with words and a beat, Dan recorded his song in his home studio since built after the days of Stephanie had passed. He'd re-record the song several times before finally being satisfied with the end product, and then he'd begin to enlist help in production for the video aspect of it. The video would have 2 on-location scenes apart from his house, the bar and the apothecary. After securing permission to shoot these from both owners, Dan would reach out to an unlikely ally in these times who happened to be a cinematographer. Through all that had happened, Dan reconciled with his past lover, the one he had left after the Jeep accident those painfully long months ago. The two would go on to be best friends despite what had happened, and Amanda held a degree in filmmaking that she had been working on while they were still together. It seemed unlikely that she'd want to help him after all that he put her through, but she agreed to the project, and the two would set up dates to film the scenes well enough in advance to have the editing done in time for the release date. Tylee was on board for the role of Stephanie in this video, even going as far as to sport a red wig in order to get her character as accurate as possible. By this time, many of Dan's friends who didn't know Stephanie would know of what had happened between them, but he'd never go as far as to expose her to those close to her. He still valued her too much to ruin her life, but he hoped that this music video would send the message that he missed her, even as a friend. The music video was met with huge success. Dan's subscription count on YouTube would nearly double, and he'd rake in several hundred views on the night of the premiere. It may not sound like much, but this was a lot for a small amateur music channel. Several people that Stephanie was friends with had watched the video, and yet they had no idea that it was based on her affair with him. Dan would find peace in this, that they knew what had happened even if they'd never make the connection. He'd hoped that she'd contact him regarding the video, but still a message never came. He had long since stopped checking her barren Facebook profile because seeing her picture brought back too much heartache for him, but he hoped she was at least doing well. Though he could feel when she had a bad day because the connection was never truly severed, and the bad days tallied up much higher than the good ones. He still wished the best for her. And it was killing him inside. Chapter 12. I Want to Watch You Burn. As the election drew nearer, and being that this was now a full year since their initial encounters, Dan's psyche would take a deep turn towards the earth once again. His finances hadn't been in order for months as the pandemic continued to rock his workflow, and all that felt like his had been stripped from his hands. His bar opened back up, and he thought, screw it, this is my bar, I'm gonna go. The uncertainty in the air as his eyes darted in search of her car was tense, but he did not find it. He would feel uneasy walking into the bar, but after a few drinks had hit his brain, he would feel back at home again with very little worry of having her show up. An eventful and lively night aside, Dan would inevitably make the mistake of drunkenly texting Stephanie, and it garnered no response. Up until this point, Dan believed that they were both just too stubborn to make the first move. He thought she'd missed him just as much, but remembered, as she said, she's not the type to chase a conversation. He thought maybe if he texted her first, things could go back to the way they were before they had gotten together, and it seemed hopeful for him. After over a week of no response from her and falling back into his own suspenseful sorrow, he'd text her again. This time, after several hours, the message bubble would turn green, indicating that she had blocked his phone number. And so, once again, our protagonist found himself nameless. His identity was stripped as the pipe dream came to an end, and he would find closure in this action, though he'd never be the same. Our nameless man would put to rest this fairy tale of dreams that were too good to be true and continue on as he was before. His strawberry heathen would no longer exist in this world, and though the feel of her touch would fade with time, the memories would continue to haunt him in the prophetic dreams he'd have each night. The man had undergone a spiritual awakening through Stephanie. He would discover that he had gained psychic abilities through his mother's lineage, and that being with Stephanie for even just that short amount of time had woken it up. The dreams would continue, and though most of them would paint her in need of help, the man simply turned over in his sleep and changed the channel, pulling in knowledge from the gods about other aspects of his life. It was in dreaming that the man would remember who he really is and finally start to accept his life the way that it sits. His given name is Joe, and he's worth much more than he gives himself credit for. Thank you.